Hi, this is Alex Bryant. Welcome to the East West Associates webinar today. This is our last one of the year. It's on global manufacturing supply chain footprint analysis and implementation. We've got a large group of people who have signed up for today, and we've got a great set of speakers. I'm going to jump right into it. For those who are new, welcome. For those who've been to the East West webinars before that, welcome back. The point of these is we're going to move through parts 1, 2, 3, and 4 very quickly. That'll be no more than about 15 minutes. We're going to spend about 45 minutes on questions part 5 and 6, right? That's core. We've got 2 very good case studies today that we think will be very relevant, and then we're going to get in the Q&A discussion, which should be about 30 to 35 minutes, right? And so we got 3 very good speakers who want this to be a back and forth discussion. We've already got a lot of questions sent in to us. If you have further questions you would like to ask, please click on your control panel. And when you do click on the control panel, you will see that there's a place for you to put in a question, type it in, and we'll get to it. If in some cases we have too many questions and we can't get to all of them, if that's the case, and we cannot get to your question, we will answer within an email or a phone call within a 48-hour period. Okay, so we'll jump right into it. First, let me introduce East West. I'm Alex Bryant, president of East West. East West has been around since 2005. The people that we have work for East West are all individuals who live on the ground in country, and we've got a team in all of our regions, which is China, Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia would include Thailand, Vietnam, Philippines, etc., Mexico, Poland, Central Eastern Europe. We've got people on the ground in all those locations. All the people that work for us all have really one qualification, which they had P&L responsibilities for running a U.S. or Western multinational on the ground in that market. So they know how to make money in that market, and they do it within the confines of the U.S. law, right? Many of them came up in operations and sales, but they all had P&L responsibilities for running companies on the ground. So therefore, they've been exposed to quite a bit. East West gets involved in 4 things, right, that we stick to. First is global manufacturing and supply chain footprint, which is what we're talking about today. And that involves a lot of plant closure, plant consolidation, plant relocation, a lot of global supply chain and manufacturing analysis. We do a lot of the strategic evaluation, and then we do the implementation. Includes site selection, includes negotiating if we're moving operation to a new location, getting the sites and negotiate with the government for the right kind of tax incentives or other incentives that we can obtain. Second area is operational commercial performance, and this is primarily our M&A due diligence practice, as well as our corporate turnaround restructuring practice. Third area is supply chain. We do all aspects of supply chain, identifying suppliers, qualified suppliers, third-party contract manufacturers, supplier transition, supplier setup. We are supplier performance improvement. We're doing that in all China, Southeast Asia, Mexico, Poland, Eastern Europe. And finally, is human resource and risk management. And that is primarily executive search work. And then we're doing an awful lot of integrity awareness training right now. A lot of that is in China, as we have companies who are facing increased situations of fraud and corruption in their China operations, and some of them. And we're putting in our own team of general managers, and our operational people, and our HR people to run that facility and turn that facility around, and to kick out the people that have been for fraud and corruption, and then bring on the permanent replacements. All right, so without further ado, we've talked about this is the locations where we operate. This is a list of our sampling clients. If you want to go on our website, you can see additional East West associate clients. So let me turn to the webinar series. We are now doing the 6th of, we're on the last one, global manufacturing supply chain footprint analysis. We will, in first quarter, we will be bringing out another webinar agenda and a list of webinars for first quarter. We'll be rolling that out in January. All right, as we keep the thing moving, so we get into part 4 and part 5 and part 6 case studies in the Q&A. Let me briefly introduce the speakers. Dan, if you would introduce yourself, and then Mark and Jacob.
Sure, thanks, Alex. Yeah, Dan McLeod. Been working with East West for about 7 years now. Prior to that, I was living in Asia more than 20 years. I come from a background with engineering and operations management. So went to China in the late 90s, like many folks did, to set up a factory, and ended up staying in China for a total of 13 years on and off out of the next 20. And also in Southeast Asia, both in Singapore and the Philippines, where I was involved in running facilities, oversight of a regional supply chain and manufacturing network, also oversee design and construction and startup of larger investments. Since I've been working with East West, I've had opportunity to not just work in Asia, but to expand and take on assignments looking at Mexico, both supply chain, site selection, opportunities there, and also in Central Europe, where we've done a fair amount of supply chain and site selection work as well. Mark?
Yeah, and thanks, Dan. Yes, I've been with Alex now in East West for about 11 years, and prior to that, I was in Asia since really 1990. Started out in Thailand and with Trane Air Conditioning, and ran the Indochina business out of there, which included Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand, of course. And then I moved up, like a lot of guys did, in 93 or 94, up to China, and pretty much stayed in China until 2013 when I came back and joined with Alex. So a lot of experience in running, these fairly large multinationals with multiple manufacturing sites, multiple test labs, multiple after-sales service, parts, warranty. Did a lot of business in China for China, a lot of business in China, outside of China, a lot of business setting up the new operations in Vietnam when the embargo was lifted by President Clinton back in '93. So pretty much, and then since been with Alex. Early on, we did a lot of work in helping people in China. Subsequently, the last 5 years, a lot of work with, frankly, relocating manufacturers out of China to Southeast Asia or Central Europe or even in Mexico. So pretty solid background in Asia, running some fairly large businesses. Jacob, please.
Thanks, Mark. I'm Jacob Miller. I'm based in Vietnam. I've been abroad for nearly 3 decades now. I spent 9 years in Mexico, 14 years in China, and the last 5 I've been in Vietnam. I've been working with East West for about the last 4 years. Started off my career as an engineer, working with operations, doing setting up factories and stuff. And then, especially during my time in China, the first half of that 14 years I spent setting up operations, setting up purchasing offices and other things. And then the last half of it, mostly downsizing and restructuring companies and helping them move out of China. And then for the last 5 years, I've been based in Vietnam, primarily focusing on companies that are closing down or downsizing their operations in China and moving them over to Vietnam.
Yeah, and Jacob's also dropped a lot of our supply chain work in Vietnam. Then Von Spires, Paul Von Spires, was third-party contract manufacturers. All right, so we'll keep now. We've got that. I'm going to briefly look at why manufacturers are relocating out of China, some of the critical considerations, and this is quite relevant to what's driving a lot of this activity. So, Mark, I will turn this over to you.
Yeah, sure. So like a lot of us. We went to China 20, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, even 15 years ago, and for a couple reasons: big domestic market and really competitive labor. Well, what's changed? Well, labor costs now have been rising for the last 7-10 years, and that's put pressure on our initial model. Next slide, please, Alex. Then, of course, China's become a little bit more difficult than it was back in the 90s. And they've become a little bit more China-centric, which has caused some problems. Next slide, please, Alex. Again, so what happens? We all went to China. We set up operations. Our director of engineering has left, started up their own operation. The next thing you know, we've got competitors. And then what happened? So after all that, then China decided, well, we know how to do this pretty well. So let's have a China buy, China 2025, and encourage our people to buy from Chinese companies. Next slide, please. Then, of course, in 2017, 2018, when the duties the duties came in, so you're manufacturing in China and your costs now have gone up 25% if you're exporting to the USA. Next slide, please. And then of course, and then what really threw a monkey wrench into a lot of things was COVID. We couldn't travel there. We couldn't keep an eye on our operations. A lot of bad things happened. And then of course, things have slowed in China. Their export business is slowing. Everything's so the reasons we all went to China, a lot of us 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago, most of those reasons have, except for those of us who are still there for domestic consumption, most of those reasons have really changed. And that's why people are reevaluating their footprints. Okay, so we have, we do a lot of surveys with our clients, and there's multiple answers. They've answered questions a couple of times, but basically, where are you going if you leave China? Well, a lot of it's staying in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Thailand, Philippines, etc. Some of it's reshoring, going back to the USA, 37%. A big piece is Mexico. Again, if your consumption is in the States, Mexico geographically makes a lot of sense. 11% Central and Eastern Europe. Well, a lot of clients of ours went to China early on because it was so cost competitive that they could produce in China and ship to Western Europe and still be competitive. Well, as the labor costs went up, that didn't work any longer. So we've been able to relocate some Chinese manufacturers to Central and Eastern Europe to supply their domestic European operations. So that's kind of what's been going on in the last 3 or 4 years as far as where are people going when they decide to do a China plus one, which is what a lot of guys do. Next slide, please, Alex.
Thank you, Mark.
Sure.
So we're now gonna, as we talked about parts 1 through 4, we're gonna have those clicked in together in the first 13 minutes. So we're staying on schedule. This is where we're gonna spend a lot of our time here in part 5 and part 6, right? We've got 2 great case studies today that we think will be very relevant to this whole idea of global manufacturing supply chain footprint analysis. Go through those 2 case studies in depth, and then we'll hit the Q&A discussion, which will be about 30 minutes or 30, 40 minutes. All right, so first let me turn it over to Mark Plum and ask Mark if he would first kind of lay out the first case study, please.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Alex. So yeah, this is a really interesting one. It's it's a global manufacturer with a large footprint. But the thing that was very interesting about them, just at the 30,000 foot level, they were in 5 countries, including the States, but most of their consumption was all back in the States. So they'd set up this global manufacturing footprint around the world 15, 20, 25 years ago. And it kind of sprawled, and they asked us to kind of come in and take a look at it. So what did they have? Well, like a lot of people, they had set up in China early on. They had 2 operations in China, 2 manufacturing operations in China. They had 3 manufacturing operations in Thailand and 1 in Vietnam. And then of course they sourced components for a lot of that from China, because they had established a pretty good Chinese component supply base. So what happened? So basically, like a lot of people, they're in China. They got those 2 facilities. The tariffs really were difficult for them. The increased competition would hurt them a lot. And then of course the COVID situation. So then they sat back and said, hey, let's stop here. Let's take a look at how this thing is sprawled. What's changed from 20 years ago? Why did we go to China 20 years ago? Does that still make sense? Why did we go to Thailand 15 years ago? Does that still make sense? Why did we go to Vietnam? Why are we making all this stuff in Ohio? Why do we do all that? So let's reevaluate all of that. So we did. Next slide, please, Alex.
Sure.
Okay, so and then after we sat down with them, we said, okay, well, let's together, what can this study do for us? What's our deliverables? Well, okay, first thing, let's do a deep assessment of where you are right now. What's your footprint? Where do you manufacture? What does it cost? What do you buy? What do you build? What do you source? Where do you sell? What's your revenues? What's your flow of product? What's it cost you to move product? take a look at the product lines and sourcing, which suppliers make sense, which maybe don't make sense. Okay, fine. And we did that at headquarters to get a real deep dive on their whole operation, their cost by product, their cost by factory, their cost by landed cost, by freight, et cetera, et cetera. Then we said, let's go and do an on-the-ground due diligence on the 6 manufacturing sites. So take a look at the 2 and spend time there in China. Take a look at the 3 in Thailand, the one in, of course, Vietnam, and as well as the trading company that was still in China as well. Also, particularly in China, take a look at the suppliers. Which suppliers make sense, which ones look good, which ones may not look so good, which ones can move, which ones can't move, et cetera, et cetera. Then kind of then we have our metrics and we put a scoring sheet together to say, okay, how does all this look now? How did it look 20 years ago? How does it look now? You're building all this product in the States, in the USA, in China, shipping to the States. How does that look? How would it look if we put it in Vietnam, perhaps you put it in Thailand, perhaps if you put it in Mexico. We also did a lot of work on, okay, we're in Southeast Asia, we're in the USA, in the southern parts. Can we take a look at maybe setting up some manufacturing operations in Mexico? Look at site selections, labor costs, land costs, lease costs, building costs, etc., to see maybe we should offload some of the higher labor cost products in Ohio and move them down to Mexico. That was part of our deliverables. And then at the end, come up with a plan. So how would we rationalize this global footprint of 5 countries and 5 to 6 manufacturing facilities and numerous component suppliers? Next slide, please, Alex. So just a kind of a graphic look at what we did and how it turned out. So we decided in the United States, okay, we can consolidate there and shrink it a little bit because it's kind of some high labor areas in Ohio. And then we can maybe move something so we can move some of that stuff to contract manufacturing and component suppliers out of Mexico. So that was kind of how we looked at maybe the USA-Mexico partnership. Then, as I mentioned, in China, we had really 3 entities. We had the 2 factories and a sourcing office. So we closed the 2 facilities in China, but kept the sourcing office open because of the fact of we can still use those component suppliers as we move to Thailand and Vietnam. So then our next step was take a look at Thailand. We have 3 facilities. Kind of we could consolidate because of product and product configuration down to 2. We could then begin to move from one of the factories in China, a large part of that manufacturing bit down to Thailand, use some of the component suppliers from China into Thailand, and then to localize with other products, other parts in Thailand to get us local content, to get us so we can substantially transform that product to allow us 0 duties now on that product from Thailand to the USA versus 25% duties from China to the USA. And subsequently, we did almost the same thing in Vietnam, where we took the other factory, most of what was produced in China, moved it to Vietnam in the existing facility. Then we added a little bit to that facility and moved some of the product from the USA to that Vietnamese facility. Now that product has, again, we find local suppliers, some Chinese suppliers, add local content, substantially transform, and now we're able to move product from Vietnam to the USA at 0 duty. So in essence, we took our whole China operation, moved it, and went from 25% duties to 0 duties because we produced in Vietnam and Thailand. Next slide, please, Alex. Okay, so the just to kind of the results of what really went well here. I'm going to talk a little bit and hand it off to some of the guys, but the whole thing was driven by China, really driven by the fact of the geopolitical and the labor and the tariff increases in China, which everyone's had experience since really 2017, 2018. And it's really come to a head here in the last few years. So with that, I want to hand it off to Dan to talk in more details about what we were able to accomplish in Mexico. Dan?
Yes, thanks, Mark. Yeah, first, we focused on a couple areas. We looked at potential supplier base and contract manufacturing and tried to line that up with the client's primary manufacturing processes. And they do a lot of injection molding. They've done it in-house. For example, they've done a bit of metal bending, stamping, and a lot of assembly work. So those processes appeared to be a good fit for Mexico. We started out with looking for contractors primarily focused on injection molding parts, and found a number of people that would be interested and capable, and looked across their manufacturing and looked at their potential spend and determined that by just outsourcing or contracting that key process, with savings of approximately $3 million a year. We then looked at options for relocating the whole factory, and again, that it's a significant capital investment, but outstanding savings, $8 million annually. You'd have a return on that investment of 2 to 3 years, so it was reasonably attractive. So that's what we found in Mexico. And then Jacob, a little bit about Southeast Asia.
Yeah, in Vietnam, we moved some of their production lines down from China into Vietnam. One of the things special there was we were able to get the approval to bring in some used equipment, which in normal times, Vietnam does not easily allow you to bring in some used equipment, but we were able to get that approved. And then we also started bringing in some production lines from the US for some lower value things that were produced in the US that were more suitable for the lower labor costs in Vietnam. And that went to the point of why we had to expand the facility to bring in some of these new production lines. And then also the other thing that we looked at a lot was, although the trading company was still operating in China, when we did an analysis of what they were buying, there was a huge percentage of the items that were kind of commodity things that could be purchased also in Vietnam. And we advised them to set up more of a sourcing office and start being able to purchase more of those items locally, especially if they're items that could easily be purchased in Vietnam, just to have secondary suppliers for everything. And then there was a couple things that, we'll have to buy them out of China for the foreseeable future, just because of the quantities were low and it was specialty items. And I'll turn this back over to Mark, since he was taking care of Thailand.
Yeah. Thanks, Jacob. Yeah. So I worked on the Thailand piece, having been there a lot over the years, and we consolidated down to 2 facilities. We were able then to really almost move the one complete facility from China to Thailand, and we were able to actually, we of course lower our labor costs. We had a well-trained labor force there that was very familiar with this type of production, and then of course, as Jacob just said, we were able to then find local fast-moving parts, fasteners and all that kind of stuff, and then be able to add labor, add packaging, all that, to get local content to then allow us to be able to ship these products back to the States and part of the treaty with Thailand in the USA. And in addition, because we moved so much more business there, we then hired one general manager to actually run both facilities, instead of having 2. And then we helped them bring in a director of finance to oversee the whole thing. So all in all, it worked out quite well for both Thailand and then obviously Vietnam and Mexico. So we have to say it was a pretty successful project for us working with this client.
Yeah.
And then I think Dan, we're going to talk about, I think, case number 2.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah.
Yes, so second case study is another a U.S. manufacturer, this time based in Illinois. Consumer products, generally adjacent to the appliance industry. And so we had worked with this company a few years ago to help them get set up in Poland. They didn't have a European manufacturing presence, and their business had grown to such a point where they were importing the material they were importing from China to sell and from the US to sell in Europe was the logistics cost, the warehousing cost, and the time from manufacturing to get it to the customer was excessive. And we helped them set up in Poland. So we began talking with them about their North American footprint, in which case their large, well-established factory in the Chicago area had been in operation since the 50s. A lot of older, aging assets that they were faced with decisions on whether or not to replace it in kind. Their throughputs were deteriorating, in large part because of the age of the equipment that they were having to outsource certain significant process steps, which added expense to them, certainly. And they'd also had a difficult time with labor, not just wages, but the ability to retain staff was becoming difficult, and it was constraining their ability to meet their production targets. So we looked at other options for them in North America. And the first one would be to construct a new factory and a distribution center, essentially lift and replace in the Southeast US, where expected to find more favorable labor costs and utility costs and building construction. Second option we looked at was in Mexico to identify potential partners for contract manufacturing or set up a joint venture or other arrangement. And this would be do the manufacturing in Mexico with a company that had a very similar processing capability, stamping, enameling, sort of key manufacturing processes for them. And then that would be shipped to a DC in the US for distribution. And then the third scenario was to establish an owned factory, wholly owned factory in Mexico, and then do distribution, a new distribution center in the US, where they would source primarily from Mexico, but also would continue to have some key components would have to be supplied from Asia, but it would be very limited. Next slide. So again, I mentioned the Southeast. We looked at 10 states and looked at a number of regions within each state. Really focused on the labor pool, the logistics, how are they placed with major interstates, rail, in some case, ocean going. Utility costs, I mentioned that natural gas is a key consideration, a key item that they need to have. And so looking at the cost and availability of gas was key. We worked with a number of local development agencies and were able to model the cost for labor, for construction costs, operating costs, and understand the incentives. So incentives in the US are very regional, but were quite attractive. We found some very attractive incentives, land price and workforce development, which was pretty impressive as we talked to various development agencies. For contract manufacturing, we're able to identify 2 potential partners, and our folks in Mexico did have a relationship with them and had business dealings with them in the past, so that helped us be able to meet the right people and talk to the right people. We developed sort of a head of terms going into this, and what would the relationship look like from the client's perspective to see if it was a fit. And then we developed a project economics, looking at materials, labor costs, overheads, freight, distribution costs, and rolled that all up together. Next slide. And the third one was Mexico manufacturing. Again, we came up with 5 cities that were growing, but not terribly hot from a real estate cost or labor cost standpoint. So we found some locations that logistically would be doable, not terribly far from the border, and that were not overdeveloped yet. So wage rates were more reasonable, and there wasn't a high demand for labor. And again, we developed that budgetary cost for setting up the factory, but also for moving a substantial amount of equipment, dismantled and move that equipment, which was a very significant expense in this case. And again, it was, I mentioned earlier, they had aged assets, so the analysis of whether do we move equipment or we buy new equipment was key here. Next slide. And so, you know, what we found, the conclusions that, again, between Mexico and the U.S. from a cost standpoint, wasn't a lot of difference. You could take advantage of lower labor costs in Mexico at about 30 to 35% of what they're paying in the U.S. You had tariff avoidance, certainly. But what we found is the utility costs were higher, 10 to 15% higher. Freight was significant. In this case, the products tended to be bulky, and so, you know, freight was a significant consideration there. We did find they had a decent supplier base in Mexico for the kind of products they're looking, you know, cut and stamping of steel and stainless steel. I mentioned injection molded plastics were all key, and found a good supplier base for those materials, particularly in the northeast part of the country, Monterrey area. So where we left it with the client at that point, and where we've been working with them, is on developing a supplier base. And we laid out it would take 1 to 3 years to develop a supplier base in Mexico and begin to transition to those suppliers. And when that work was further along, then we start to look at a relocation strategy. Long term would be to do manufacturing in Mexico, long term. So thanks, Alex.
Thank you, Dan. Okay, so we continue to move into our discussions on the Q&A. Here we have 11 questions. Here are the first 6, and we've got another 5 after them. And again, if you all, I know we've got some questions, but again, for those who joined, if you have questions, please feel free to go onto the control panel on the right, type in the questions that will come to us. We've got a bunch, so if we don't get to everybody today, we will then follow up either in an email to you or a phone call within the next 48 hours. Okay, let's dive on into the questions that we've gotten. First question was, I guess, is a common question. About what are the key issues which executives are facing when they begin to diversify the supply chain to manufacturing? And Mark, I'll start off with you. Why don't you tackle that one?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So no, thanks, Alex. So yeah, so what's happened in case, you know, China has really been the impetus, and a lot of people have gone to China, went to China, and then now they've been there 10, 15, 20 years. And some of the managers now that are running these businesses weren't there. So, you know, they aren't familiar with, well, now how do I leave a country? I mean, I've been there. Now what do I do? I mean, how my suppliers are here. You know, my labor is here. I'm familiar with these areas. And so then all of a sudden now you have to make decisions. Oh, well, you got geopolitical risk. Is that going to kind of maybe force you to move? Yeah, it could, obviously, because of China. The risk of tariffs, certainly. So the things you have to really look at is, you know, the thought process that you did when you went to China to begin with is the same thought process you should look at now when you decide to maybe go a China plus one or diversify. You know, where are your clients? Where are your customers? You know, where are your component suppliers? Where's the labor? Where's the labor availability? When you went to China, you probably had incentives. Now, let's look at other areas. Thailand, for example, Vietnam, you know, tax incentives, land incentives, labor incentives. So it's really the kind of the same process that, you have to begin why you went to China. Now, why is the reasons you want to leave China? And then what's the metrics you need to use when you want to go find some new areas to go to? So that's kind of a 20,000 foot answer to that question.
Jacob, that's great, Mark. I agree with all that. Jacob, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, as people are looking at going out, it's, one of the big things is looking at where your industry is moving, where your customer is moving, where's the growth. Countries like Vietnam, which has a younger population, a growing middle class, versus China, where it's a decreasing population. There's opportunities to look at other markets just because of that.
Good point.
That's a good point. Yeah. Dan, let me ask you a question. We're talking about this, about diversified supply chain and such. If you look at a question 2 here about signs of a business climate improving in China, right? China's what's kind of driving a lot of this. Are you seeing signs of a business climate improving at all in China? And then there's a question around for a number of companies about moving west to reduce costs where they got urban sprawl. Can you address that?
Sure. It's a question whether or not the economy in China has bottomed out, and that's it appears that it has. The government's taking some actions to essentially put money into the economy, but it's we haven't seen a strong recovery yet, and most of the statistics quoted are likely to be an optimistic estimate of prospects for the economy. You're starting to see deflation in pricing, and you're starting to see manufacturers producer price index and producer sentiments being negative. So, the government agencies, development agencies have been for the last 2 years, certainly been putting on a bit of a charm offensive, looking for foreign direct investment. You're really making outreach to companies, but at this point, you don't see a strong uptick. As far as moving west, if your customer base is in China, and if you're selling, for example, into the middle class, if you target customer base is primarily in the middle class, then you may see opportunities away from the East Coast of the country to get into some developing domestic markets. But in general, there are some incentives, but you don't hear a lot of discussion about MNCs moving west. Domestic Chinese companies certainly, but not so much with international companies.
Yeah, I guess the ones we've seen have been, if someone's got a facility they put in 20 years ago where it was in a field and now it's got a shopping center next door to it, then they try to maybe move west to lower costs. Mark, would you agree with those comments from Dan? Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, no, I would agree. If you're in China for China, then sure, you have to really work hard to optimize what you're doing. But if you're there for other reasons, as an export or component supplier things, then it makes sense to begin to look at other areas.
Yeah, and Jacob, you don't see the business climate improving in China.
Yeah, I mean, it's slightly improved over the last couple of years because 2-3 years ago, government wasn't particularly friendly, businesses weren't particularly friendly, but in the last, especially year, the factories have been becoming aggressively nice because they're trying to improve their prices to be able to keep the clients from moving to other markets. So that's one thing, but it's also the general business is not good. So it's something to look at in other markets where there might be growth.
Right, and then we even see a lot of Chinese leaving China and trying to relocate down to Vietnam and other markets.
Yeah. Yeah.
And on that, return to question 3, kind of take that idea of companies from China going to other places, Western companies trying to diversify a China plus one strategy. Mark, let me ask you about question 3. If we're looking to locate or relocate, what are the in-country factors? There are obviously a lot of them, and it depends on the particular client, particular industry. What are some of the core factors you're looking at? I know you've mentioned these 4 to me, but I know there are a lot more.
Yeah, no, you're right. Well, and we do a lot of this, and as I said earlier, it's kind of like what you did when you went to China to begin with. So, okay, people, a lot of times you want to talk about, of labor, costs of labor, and that's important. But but labor may only be a small percentage of your BOM, your bill of materials. So sometimes availability of skilled labor is more important. So again, so when you go to a new country like you did when you went to China, what does land cost? What does buildings cost? Do you have a domestic market? Are there component suppliers there that can support your business? Can you ingress and regress really well? What's the duty structure back to the States? What's utility costs? Incentives. I mean, government incentives. China was throwing incentives around quite a bit, back in the 90s, whether it was tax or land or what have you. Those are all gone, of course, now. So if you go to other areas, are there incentives there? How long are the incentives? If it's a couple-year incentive, well, that may not do you any good. If you're starting a manufacturing operation, you may not be profitable to the 3rd or 4th year. So, do you need incentives of 8 years, 10 years, 12 years on corporate income tax? All those kind of things are part of the 10, 15, 20 metrics that you look at, and some are more important to your particular business, some are less important. What's the transparency, what's the corruption, all that kind of stuff is all factors into your rankings and ratings. And once you do that, it'll guide you to where is best for you.
It's a good point, Mark. One question to you, we put facilities in all throughout Southeast Asia and Mexico and China and elsewhere. When you're looking at, can you talk a little bit about kind of when you're trying to look at in-country factors and compare, and you talked earlier about incentives. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the incentive program structure of Thailand versus Vietnam, because they're kind of different?
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about Thailand, and then of course Jacob can talk about a little bit about Vietnam. So Thailand is really interesting. They do it from a corporate standpoint, unlike China did, meaning you had to sometimes negotiate with a province or an industrial park. And in Thailand, you work with what they call the Thai BOI, the Thailand Board of Investment. It's driven from the federal level on down, and once you negotiate with them in Bangkok. And then get their approvals for what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, who you're going to hire, how many you're going to hire, what kind of technology are you bringing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They will come back and give you a ranking anywhere from A1 to like B10. Well, so in the A category, in the case of a couple clients we've taken there, you get an A2 or an A3 seal of approval, so to speak, from the Thai BOI. That gave our clients 8 years of no corporate income tax, 0, and then another 5 years at 50%. Once you have that, then you go to your developers and your people you buy land from, the people are going to build your building for you, people that are going to supply you. Once they see that you're a BOI approved, invested company, the doors really open up really quite well for you at that point in time. Importing components, exporting and finished product, et cetera, et cetera. So it's federally driven, top down, and I don't want to say seamless, but it's pretty efficient. I'll let Jacob talk a little bit about Vietnam.
Yeah, Vietnam is quite different. It's not really bottom up, but it is very location specific and can be province specific, industrial park specific, industry specific, because there can be some general incentives. So everything that you need to look at in Vietnam is you need to look at the location of where it is, the province's benefits, the benefits for that specific industrial zone, the specific benefits for your industry, and then you might have to negotiate with the local government to help you get licenses or other things that they would need to support you to get to the federal government to get that approved. So it's a much more challenging situation. It's not as easy as Thailand, where you can just go to one government one government group and know what's going to happen. In Vietnam, you're going to have to go talk to several different locations and contrast and compare and do pluses and minuses of each.
Right, and Dan, I would think it's fair to say Mexico is a little even further different than that, right? They're not offering the same incentives like Vietnam and Thailand are.
Yeah, it's very low, locally specific, and certainly the kind of incentives that you would see, offered in Thailand in particular would be far from that. You get a little bit, maybe some property tax or employment tax benefits, maybe some breaks in utility connection or utility fees, setup fees, but by and large, it's you don't see the same array of incentives available in Mexico as you would see in, for example, in Thailand or the U.S.
Right. Let me ask you a question here. The question number 5, I thought was in 6, were pretty interesting. On 5, Jacob, let me ask you this question. But talk about global footprint analysis. When you're doing that, you talk about little labor costs relative to China. Do they really matter anymore? And it's not just China, but Vietnam, Thailand, and the question this person wanted to know about it was hourly rate still a relevant question.
Yeah, I mean, this is one thing that I've faced. I faced it when I was in China. I face it here in Vietnam, because a lot of clients come to us. They're really overly focusing on the labor rates, but then we go, we just had a recent project that we found out that the labor rates were only 8% of their cost. So even if we could save substantially on the labor, there was only 8% there to save. The big savings was in other parts of the process of sourcing the items cheaper or more efficiently in other regions.
Right.
So a lot of times people really need to look at how much of your cost is really labor, and should you even worry about the labor cost that much. It's just a small, for Vietnam and for a lot of industries, it's just a small benefit. It's a benefit, but it's small.
Yeah, and I think on labor costs, I think Mark, you've talked about that like Thailand's gonna be a little different than Vietnam and China because it's top down versus a market economy.
Yeah, you're right. So in China and Vietnam, the government kind of says, hey, this year we're going to, wages are going to go up to 8, 10, 12, 14, whatever number is. And it's very little market interaction. And they could do that when things were already running well. In Thailand, of course, it's a little bit more market driven. And Thailand, to be quite frank, is really trying to attract business. I mean, we say internally here that, Thailand was China before China was China, meaning there's a tremendous manufacturing base in Thailand that really wants to ramp back up again. But you got to be careful. Certain products would fit well into Thailand, but certain products may fit well based into Vietnam or Mexico. So that's why you need to do the study, and everything has to be factored towards your particular needs. Thailand may be better. Vietnam may be better. Poland, Central Eastern Europe may be better in Mexico. So, yeah, but Jacob's exactly right. The labor availability is probably becoming in most areas now really more critical than labor costs.
Yeah, 100% agree. Yeah, absolutely. While we're on, let's take a look for supply chain for a minute. Mark, I'm going to ask you a little bit about optimizing, really about substantial transformation, right? Because that's really critical as we are relocating from China to other locations.
Yeah.
Yeah. And let's talk about that, particularly in terms of, how companies are optimizing Chinese suppliers within ASEAN, how they're getting the substantial transformation. You've talked a little bit about it here. I know there are lots of points. Can you discuss that for a minute?
Yeah, so this is really topical, guys. I mean, now if you and then to be brutally honest, and with change of administration, there's going to be a lot more scrutiny on products coming in from U.S. Customs and as far as duties, no duties, what country, where, why, how. So you really need to be very cognizant of the fact. Uh, some countries over the years have tried and it's really been a disaster, I think, what's happened, trying to pass products through, take something from China, run it through another country, take a motorcycle, take the handlebars off, run it through, put the handlebars on in another country and call it made X and then think they're going to bring it in duty free. Those days are completely done. So what a lot of companies now are really doing with both Thailand and Vietnam is setting up their operations. Some of them have great suppliers in China, right? They've had them for years, and they're integral to their manufacturing process. So maybe you stay with those suppliers. Maybe they make up 30-40% of your cost of bill of material. You ship those down into, say, Vietnam, say the Haiphong area. Jacob can talk about this a lot, which is really close to the Guangdong province. You start adding local content, local labor, local margins, quick moving parts, fasteners, stuff that you can find locally, shipping, packaging, etc. Get to 50% of local content, get that approved then by customs in the USA as well as Vietnam. Now you've substantially transformed that product with some parts from China, the rest put together in Vietnam and shipped to the USA. You go from 25% duties to no duties. So Thailand has a little different regulations, but the same general idea. A combination of Chinese components with Thai components, Thai labor, Thai fasteners, Thai markets, Thai profit, all that kind of stuff, packaging, substantially transform the product and then work with customs, and then you can bring in from then into Thailand from to the USA at duty free. And that was really the basis so much of that first case we went through, taking those high duty products out of there, move them to Vietnam, move them to Thailand, substantially transform them in those countries to get local content and then ship to the States.
And that's so critical right now in this environment.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Yeah. All right, as we're going through this, continue some of the questions here. Dan, if you're looking here about China and you're looking at other countries as far as business favorability to China, right? A lot of people are looking at the China plus one model and they're looking at where else they're going in Southeast Asia, Mexico, Poland, where have you. And within Southeast Asia, lots of different locations. Can you talk a little bit about the kind of business climate that's favorable in within Thailand, Vietnam? You spent a year in the Philippines. What that business climate is like now compared to China? Because people are taking a hard look at those different countries in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, certainly, as Mark talked quite a bit about Thailand and the Board of Investments and their interest in and their relative ease of working with them to understand the business climate and get their support. So there's certainly that's a positive. In the Philippines, you'd see less structure around that. We mentioned Vietnam, a little bit more local incentives and less structure in the Philippines, but in general, you've got a supportive business base and cultural ties between language capability, cultural ties between Philippines and the U.S. certainly puts that in a little different category. In Vietnam, the business climate is supportive for manufacturers moving there. A bit overwhelmed though. And Jacob, I'd like you to weigh in there a little bit too, but it seems like there's so much interest in both from manufacturers in China looking to relocate, expand into Vietnam, and also other international companies looking there. It seems to be a bit hectic there. So.
Yeah, there's a lot of even Chinese companies moving into Vietnam to try to have a manufacturing facility to avoid or help their clients avoid the U.S. tariffs. Although, one of the things that's, if you're a U.S. company and you're setting up your operations, because they know that you're going to be under a proper legal system and you're probably going to be doing business pretty legitimately. So they're not going to be challenging you very much. But your Chinese suppliers that are moving to Vietnam, the custom is going to be checking them. They're going to be considering them a high risk company that could potentially bring in something and just relabel it to sell it into the U.S. And Vietnam right now is very sensitive about this, that they really want to avoid being labeled just a transshipment point. They don't want to have the U.S. look at them that, okay, you're just a place where China's shipping goods, that to relabel it with a made in Vietnam label, then ship it to the U.S. And so China, especially Vietnam, is very sensitive about that. And they do take a lot of serious looks at any company that would be considered high risk for doing that kind of thing. But usually a U.S. company, a European company, they're going to be pretty friendly with you, and they're going to know that, hey, you're not going to do anything like that of just relabeling the made in country label.
Jacob, it's fair to assume also what we're hearing from U.S. Customs is the U.S. Customs is also taking a very hard look at imports coming in from Vietnam.
Yeah,
because they even if the Vietnamese Customs approve it, the U.S. Customs may not approve it.
Yeah, because in Vietnam, it is frequent for a lot of different products, for a lot of different industries. You can get a made in Vietnam certificate with only about 30% of the value actually being Vietnam made. However, it's very risky, and we always warn our clients against this, as even if you can get away technically with the 30%, and maybe the U.S. accepts it right now, but it's very clear that this is probably going to be scrutinized much harder in the future, and you really need to be getting at least the 51%. So the U.S. is, going to approve and agree with Vietnam that is actually made in Vietnam.
Yeah. And Dan, would you agree with that also? The U.S. Customs be looking awfully hard at Mexico as well. If you got products coming in from China, they're going to be very closely watching that.
Certainly, and that's one of the things we advise our clients, early on into a discussion like this, is to dig deep into where your materials are going to come from and the cost structure, so you'll be able to develop a solid case for a made in Mexico, made in Vietnam labeling.
Right, and that's some of the conversation Mark had about substantial transformation. Certainly understand that. Let me ask you a question. I know we're getting very close to the hour. So I wanted to ask briefly, there are scenarios on question number 3 where we've had individuals have have decided to close their facilities, primarily in China. So briefly, Dan, can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges and the problems people have when they're looking to decide to close a facility?
Well, yeah, certainly. There is risk of certainly employee relations issues, and that's one of the things we focus on, is one, having a thorough understanding of employment regulations and termination and mass layoff rules and regulations, understand what the requirements are from notifications, from severance payments, and also what's typical, not just by what's regulation, but what is typical in the area. So we understand if we understand what it's really likely to cost to sever employees. Protection against loss of intellectual property, it's a big issue. You can anywhere from product designs, raw material suppliers, product pricing, sales channel, distributor network, agency network, the whole wide range of intellectual property concerns and considerations. You want to make sure you protect that and not make it too easy for a competitor to come in and fill the vacuum that you've created. And certainly having clear messages to go out to your suppliers and customers and be able to communicate proactively with them before a major downsizing event, to assure them that you're going to continue to stay in business and you're going to pay that, you can pay the bills if it's a supplier. Maybe you may relocate your manufacturing site and share that discussion with key suppliers at an appropriate time. But these are all communication strategy, whether or not it's with employees or suppliers or customers, are key, and the government agency as well is key in planning this and executing.
100% agree with that. I think everyone would. I've got we got a question that popped up here for us. It was talking about peeling off question number 2 about some of the unique challenges in Southeast Asia. And it was specifically asking about between Thailand, Vietnam, and Philippines and Malaysia, a little bit about the transportation. So Mark, why don't, if you would tackle that? I know you've been working close to them. We're looking at Vietnam as far as Thailand, what they're trying to do is trying to set themselves up as really a logistics hub for Southeast Asia. Can you comment on that for a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. Every country wants to attract new manufacturers, certainly, and they all have positives and negatives. Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, or Thailand. From geographic, from setting up back office, from working with their local laws and customs to be able to to do all that sort of stuff. So I mean, to really understand it, you'd have to take a look at what you're doing as your specific situation, and then look at each of the 4 countries specifically to say what would make sense for us. Northern Penang, Penang area, Malaysia, strong the base of electronics manufacturers. So if that's something of interest for you, you should really look at that. Philippines, Dan, we talked about that, also a strong base for electronics manufacturers. Thailand, tremendous automotive and industry there, which then drives an appliance industry, which then drives an HVAC industry. So great metal fabrication, metal bending, and of course petrochemicals. And then of course Vietnam now, what's going on there with competitive labor rates and as a young population and growing. So this is all part of the metrics you put together for what you do, 8 or 10, 12 metrics per country, and then what comes out of that, you'll begin to see a picture for you would definitely appear that might lead one country over another.
Speaking of that, I know we are well past 12 o'clock, so a couple of minutes past. So if you need to hop off, thank you very much for participating. We've gotten a question, Mark, when you're talking. Another question popped up. Specifically, there's a question around the Philippines, and I had a conversation yesterday with the engineer in the electronics sector, and he was talking about some people have concerns around the Philippines because of there are a lot of natural disasters, right? And that's pretty fair point. And they're worried about if they're natural disasters, tsunamis, etc., seem to attract the Philippines. And is that going to affect them as a supply chain? Dan, you live there. Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, this person obviously had knowledge about Thailand or particularly Vietnam, Malaysia, but his concern around Philippines was just, is there going to be a question on Philippines as far as their ability to be a consistent supplier with the number of natural disasters they have?
Yeah, the in general, in the major metropolitan area or major industrial zones, risk from flood or typhoon is limited to primarily short-term power outages, and those businesses that have a critical need to maintain power, having backup generators is not unusual, and so most firms have taken steps to manage that. Earthquakes are going to continue to be a common occurrence, and again, in the major metropolitan areas or industrial areas, building codes are enforced and they're adequate to cover that. You rarely hear of an earthquake or results from an earthquake that's impacted the major metropolitan areas. It's usually in the provinces that have less, and quite honestly, less well-developed infrastructure. So they manage it quite well. It's disruptions are generally short-term, maybe power, but you don't see much from flooding, or you don't see much that would impact the ability to move freight, close ports or things like that. So again, it's the infrastructure's been developed to minimize those risks in again, the major urban area or major industrial sites.
Great. All right, well, look, that concludes. I know we're past this. We did have one final question. It said, questions, we will follow up with it in writing. Someone just wrote into us about allowing the count firmware and software, and we will get back to you in writing. Look, we're well past it, 7 minutes past, so do want to end this webinar. We'll respond to those additional questions that come forward. I want to thank Mark Plum. I want to thank Jacob Miller. I want to thank Dan McLeod for going through this exhaustive 2 case studies and answering all these questions and continue to stay on for 7 minutes. So thank you all very much, and this concludes today's webinar. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay.